From Putin's point of view, there is a difference between an enemy and a traitor. Enemies you fight, but someday you hope to be able to make some kind of a peace with them. Traitors, though, you can do nothing with traitors. All you can do is wipe them out, because otherwise they're going to stab you in the back.
A murder investigation being launched into the death of another Russian on British soil.
He told his uncle a fortnight before he died, if anything happens to me in the next 2 weeks, it won't be an accident.
Мама, не вернусь, прости, я не один. Пули как грибы, в поле не растут, спущенные штаны меня выдают. Пушки Маузер, гангстер Дайзер, денежки на стол, я этой ночи супервайзер. Время умирать, время выпускать коптил.
London is levitating on a sea of dirty money.
Время умирать, время выпускать коптил.
If you deal with somebody who has a very suspicious track record, someday it will come back to haunt you.
Улицы кишат духом враждующих миров. На моем плече набито, я на все готов.
Весь ланч, все закончится, да? Все, спасибо. Там, они могут поехать туда? Все, спасибо тебе большое. Спасибо. Спасибо.
While in Russia, Boris Berezovsky was probably worth about $10 billion. When he moved to London, he was probably worth about $1 billion.
Not only did he lose his financial standing, he also lost face. The idea that you have to maintain your standing in life is very deeply engraved in the Russian psyche. He'd left under a cloud, he'd lost the influence he had in Russia. There was a void inside him. And the only way really he could fill it was to foment the revolution, the coup against Putin, which would bring him the revenge, would bring him the vindication which he felt he was due.
My strategy and tactic is the same now. Yeah. To change Putin regime, political, very dangerous for Russia and for the world. There is the beginning of revolution. There is no end of revolution.
Wherever there was trouble being made for Putin, you peel back a layer and there's Berezovsky. He was there financing the Orange Revolution in Ukraine.
For 4 days now, tens of thousands of people supporting the opposition leader have been protesting on the streets of the capital, Kiev.
The Ukrainians came to him and asked for money. Most of this money went to sustain the sitting in the square in Kiev.
How critical is this moment in not just the Ukraine's future, but Russia's future?
It means that Putin is criminal, and I think that he understands himself already that.
He was behind a whole number of the colour revolutions that swept across the former Soviet bloc and was such a threat to Putin's government.
From the outset, he started using whatever money he had for undermining the Putin's regime. That's how he hired me. He viewed himself as part of the Western campaign against Putin's dictatorship. And he did everything and spent the bulk of his money on trying to educate the powers that be.
I ask you to give a very warm welcome to Mr. Boris Berezovsky.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Russia will collapse. Or Putin will collapse. Today Parliament is
in Russia. He'd done very well because he'd been a man who could manipulate the system. He had economic power and he had political power, but he found that in the West that it didn't work that way, that the business deals that he'd been able to pull off in Russia were just not happening here. Berezovsky began to think of other methods that he could use to regain power.
Around Berezovsky, there's this whole constellation of people. First and foremost is Badri.
Boris and Badri were soulmates. They were incredibly close friends.
Boris never made any important decisions without consulting with Badri.
The key relationship in all of it, on the Russian side is Badri, and on the British side is Scott.
Scott was his fixer, finding all kinds of ways to help him spend his money in the UK while he was under an international arrest warrant.
Berezovsky used to call him like my love. They're out and one of Scott's friends picks up the phone and Boris Berezovsky is like, my love, you must help me. Like, they've taken the Phantom of Love. And Scott's friend turns to him and is like,
what the fuck is the Phantom of Love? And Scott said, oh, like, it's a luxury Rolls Royce that I bought for him. It was like a vintage car from the 50s, and evidently it had been stolen.
Scott threw the party, which Bill Clinton came to. He would make sure his photographs were all over the media with drinking with Bill.
There's a photo of him and President Clinton. Have you seen that?
Scott knew a lot of rich people, you know? As you do bigger and bigger property deals, you need more and more investment and you accrue more and more debt. And that means that if you ever slip and one of those developments goes wrong and people don't get their money back, then, you know, it's all over, you know, you're out in the cold.
It was very hard to frighten Boris when his opposition to Putin started. I think he felt the threat, but he never was afraid. When he was granted asylum, it was his first victory in his fight with Putin, and was very important for him. He suddenly felt that now he is protected, and he felt that he can do whatever he wants.
In London, he tried to make some money by investing, 10 million here, 20 million there, and it always fell through because the Russians were watching him. And the moment news came that he is trying to get into some businesses, and all hell broke loose.
Со всеми ними нужно говорить о том, сколько мы хотим, в общем, грубо говоря, тратить денег.
Я начал бы с этого. Что мы хотим, я согласен, но что мы хотим означает формулировку конкретных проектов.
It would be an incredibly risky move for Boris to try and invest back in Moscow, knowing full well that that would anger Putin. But if you have this London-based property tycoon who's running around the world helping him do this and facilitating this, as the risks were high, so clearly were the rewards.
Project Moscow was a property development in the heart of the Russian capital. It was going to be a gleaming tower block full of retail units and office blocks and some residential units. I know Tom Warren is very excited to tell you about this.
Classic Scott scheme. There's this plot in the middle of Moscow, right? It's government-owned, old civil defense buildings. We'll buy it, we'll knock it down, build it up, walk away with the money. He went into business with Ruslan Formachev, who's a young financier.
Ruslan would organise the Russian side of the investment in Project Moscow, and Scott Young was going to bring in British investors into the scheme. Scott had made a commitment to come up with about £26 million to put into Project Moscow.
He was so desperate to get the deal done that he personally guaranteed the investors' money, which meant that if the deal went south, he would be on the hook for all of it.
He was always building on a house of cards, borrowing, leveraging against that borrowing, with the idea that large funnel of money was coming from this Project Moscow. Ultimately, everyone would get their payday, including him, and everything would be settled once this deal went through.
Scott's committed to put 26 million into Project Moscow, but he can't make it. You know, he's struggling. Scott needs more, right? So who else has got money? Who else puts money into the pot? Boris Berezovsky. It would be insane for Boris to make an investment in Russia in his own name. So they designed this convoluted deal, right? Where Boris Berezovsky gives a house to Scott, right? And then Scott remortgages the property, takes the money, and puts it into Project Moscow in his own name. It's convoluted, it's a pain. And it was genius, because it's Berezovsky's money. Except by the time it went into Project Moscow, it looked like it was Scott's. And it's audacious, but maybe it's crazy enough to work.
Formachev told Scott that he needed to come up with his side of the cash because Formachev had a meeting with the mayor of Moscow, who's known to be very dangerous.
Formachev is expecting money from Scott, but it's just not coming through.
Ruslan got the money together. Scott, he struggled to get the money together. You know, he starts robbing Peter to pay Paul.
He seems to be trapped in a web of sort of debt and not finding a way out.
He just couldn't come up with the money.
You suddenly have all these agreements and all these deals that fall flat on their face. A whole load of dominoes fall right on top of Scott Young and have all these people suddenly asking for their money back. And then finally, Formachev says the deal's off. And then Scott has to try and pay back all these people with money that's never materialized.
I'm going to go biblical here. Put not your trust in kings and princes. That's the moral of the story.
Unknown caller.
Excuse me, got to take this one. I'm Stephen Kay. Yep, I'm in the film business. Hello. And property business. Listen, I'm just filming at the moment. We still on for dinner? Yeah? Look, nothing would surprise me, but I think one has got to accept the fact that business is done in Russia, should we say differently to how it's done anywhere else? What is unacceptable in America or unacceptable in England or unacceptable in Germany is possibly quite acceptable in Moscow. Project Moscow was 4 or 5 pieces of industrial land put together to make one big piece. The plan was retail shops and apartments. It was a pretty fair-sized scheme. You know, if everybody had done their homework properly, right, nobody would have been an investor in this. What you have here, it's a tragedy. The man was a successful businessman. He had a nice family. I think he started mixing with people who, nothing wrong with them, but he was mixing in a society which had huge amounts of money to spend, and I think he tried to emulate other people and started chasing deals which were beyond his capabilities. It doesn't take a long time to get into trouble.
The collapse of Project Moscow is this major inflection point in the story. It's the moment when Scott Young suddenly falls from grace and goes from doing multi-million-pound deals on behalf of super rich individuals to suddenly going bankrupt and saying he has, not 2 pennies to rub together.
The Russian prosecutors went after Scott for economic crimes.
It put Scott Young firmly on the radar of the Russian authorities.
Like, what? What, like Russian intelligence agency had their own files on Scott? Phone intercepts, surveillance stuff?
They monitored his calls. They had checks at the border, so they would flag up whenever Scott Young came into Moscow.
Scott Young knew that Berezovsky's involvement exposed him and the other investors to risk. The FSB continued to pursue that interest in Scott as a frontman for Berezovsky, which was the really dangerous link in the chain for everybody who'd been involved.
Boris Berezovsky was an incredibly complex personality, and I think he did have a fatal flaw. It was a man who allowed himself to become obsessive about things. He didn't know when to call it a day.
Boris viewed himself as part of the Western campaign against Putin's dictatorship. When it turned out that the Brits do not consider him one of their own. There is this conspiracy against Russia, and Boris believed that he is part of this brotherhood.
Boris announced that he was planning a revolution in Russia, and he was intending to bring about the overthrow of Vladimir Putin.
We need to use force to change this regime. Because, first of all, this regime is anti-constitutional. It means that I am called to use force to recreate constitutional regime again.
Now, this is obviously a hugely incendiary statement, which really caused massive consternation in Russia and caused real waves in the UK. The Home Secretary said that, people who made those kinds of statements were really bringing their asylum status into jeopardy. And it was made pretty clear to Boris that if he kept on stoking that kind of trouble from the UK, he might not be allowed to remain here.
You can cause friction between the British government and Mr. Putin. Are you really worth it? What do you give back to Britain in return?
I will help British people to open eyes and to understand who is in front of them.
Boris kept enraging the Kremlin and kept, inflaming the difficulties that he already faced.
The key link was between Berezovsky and a man called Alexander Litvinenko.
Litvinenko was an FSB officer who went against the FSB. He decided to hold the national press conference, accusing their agency of a whole bunch of crimes.
3 former KGB officers announced that Boris Berezovsky was a target of the Russian intelligence that was supposedly trying to kill him. One of these 3 officers was Alexander Litvinenko.
Litvinenko was a political exile like Berezovsky.
Litvinenko fled to the UK with Boris Berezovsky's help. Litvinenko was really a central part of Berezovsky's global chess game against Vladimir Putin. Berezovsky had been financing his activities, investigating the Kremlin's involvement in a number of terrorist outrages in Russia to try to bring Putin down.
People who dealt with Berezovsky were of a certain disposition. You must understand, if you deal with somebody who has a very, very suspicious track record, whose money is not exactly clean, you have to understand that there will be problems. They may be billionaires, but they're still hustlers, and sometimes very dangerous hustlers. Because when you go into this world where people set up each other, betray each other, where people are used to dealing with criminal elements, someday it will come back to haunt you.
Thank you.
My name is Marina Litvinenko, and my husband is Alexander Litvinenko. What he did, it wasn't against his own country, it wasn't against Russian people. He always believed one day he would be able to go back to Russia. But one day he became extremely and suddenly ill. It was unbelievable. After 2 days, from very healthy, very strong man, he became completely powerless. After 13 days, they realized he was poisoned. He was transformed to intensive care hospital. And when I was ready to leave a room, And I say, Sasha, I have to go. And it was very difficult for him to talk. But suddenly he said, Marina, I love you so much. I didn't know it was his last words for me.
The British police founded polonium by chance on the 21st of day after Sasha was poisoned.
At a meeting at a London hotel, Andrei Lugovoy, along with Dmitry Kovtun, poisoned Litvinenko's tea with this radioactive substance.
Lugovoy was on assignment and he was a double agent.
Lugovoy knew Berezovsky, he knew Litvinenko, and he had used that old friendship to inveigle himself into the Berezovsky-Litvinenko circle in London. Litvinenko thought he was having a cup of tea with two old friends.
From the moment Sasha digested this polonium, he has no chance to survive because it was so high.
This is perhaps the first instance that a terrorist act has been perpetrated on the Western soil using nuclear material.
Tonight, searches for radioactive material continue in London after the authorities call the poisoning by polonium-210 unprecedented in Britain.
The police moved in on the places across London where Alexander Litvinenko spent his final few weeks.
24 venues are being monitored.
2 British Airways planes contaminated with radioactivity.
There are now tens of thousands of people all across Europe who, in one way or another, have a direct interest in the death of Alexander Litvinenko.
And it really was the most high-profile political assassination.
Tell me, please, or someone of you, how it's possible to produce polonium without state involvement? How it's possible to transport polonium without state involvement? How it's possible to put polonium in the cup of tea of Litvinenko without state involvement? And finally, I think everybody recognizes how Russian state tried to protect Putin.
Nobody was in any doubt, even at the outset, as to where the responsibility for this lay, because the availability of polonium to anyone outside the Russian state would be so extraordinary that it made it most unlikely that it hadn't been sanctioned at a high level within Russia. It sends out a very clear message that not only does Russia want to murder people with whom it disagrees or it considers they're traitors, but that they're prepared to do this in a way which was clearly designed to be detected.
For Berezovsky, that is a real warning shot. If you're in a position where that's happened to you, you are going to be scared.
The first thing I heard from Boris about this, now they will be killing us one by one.
Shortly thereafter, Badri Patakashvili died suddenly of a heart attack. He was Boris Berezovsky's closest business partner. The two of them did everything together and all of their interests were joint. There were also grounds to suspect that foul play was a factor here, given that Badri was so frightened for his life in the weeks before his death that he'd hired 120 bodyguards to guard him and told his friends he believed he would be assassinated. After his death, Berezovsky was left financially destitute because Patakashvili handled all of their joint business affairs. That really neutered Berezovsky's ability to fund political activities opposing Putin. And this was really the start of his unraveling.
Boris had a visit from police who told him that a man is coming from Russia to kill him.
Berezovsky, are you living in fear of your life?
Look, if I will tell you that I don't afraid, it will be hypocrisy. Yeah? The other question is, am I preparing to be killed or not? This is the correct question, yeah? I'm prepared.
Mr. Berezovsky says he doesn't know who the hitman was. His would-be assassin was deported to Russia.
Boris was squaring up for a big fight with another oligarch, Roman Abramovich. And although he believed he was going to win and was in line for a multi-billion-dollar payout,
he got absolutely ruined in court. You know, the judge said he was unreliable, wasn't a good witness. The amount of money that was poured into that legal battle must have been millions upon millions. At the end of that process, he was really kind of crestfallen. He fell into a depression.
Berezovsky's circumstances were so diminished that he had to lay off his very extensive security team. And he was incredibly well protected for many years, but he was so broke that he just had one bodyguard left. But also, he'd been reduced to living with his ex-wife. He'd really lost almost everything.
He said a very sad thing to me. Said that I'm losing the purpose in my life. He is not seeing the reason, the sense, the meaning in his life. It was absolutely unexpected from Boris. Yesterday you've been very, very rich, very, very known. You've been quoted by journalists from all over the world because they've been asking your opinion on political events. And today, you stop being interested to people. They cannot get any money of you. They cannot get any new information from you. So of course it was a very abrupt and very sudden change for him. He was in very bad shape, but it was not hopeless. He still had assets which could be sold, and he would have enough money for a nice and pleasant and comfortable life.
The Russian tycoon Boris Berezovsky was found dead yesterday.
The 67-year-old was found dead on the bathroom floor.
Boris Berezovsky was one of Russia's richest men who went on to become one of the most vocal critics of Vladimir Putin.
Police say at this stage there's no evidence to suggest that anyone else was involved in his death.
The family are still suspicious of the view that Mr. Berezovsky took his own life.
There are two kinds of impossibilities. There is a physical impossibility, which is generally accepted as a proof that something couldn't happen because it was physically impossible. But there is another kind of impossibility which is also very important. It's a psychological impossibility. If something is impossible for a person because he just cannot do it in his mind, it's still an impossibility. For Boris to kill himself was psychologically impossible.